Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Trauma Informed Church Kid podcast. Today and every day, we are reconstructing religion for the hurting with theology that doesn't hurt. So, first of all, just want to give a Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays to everybody who's listening. I am wearing my ugly Christmas sweater here, which is, for those of you who are watching on YouTube, you can see this is my Gandalf You Shall Not Pass shirt. So I just like to get into the holiday season and be a little bit quirky. So that's just a little bit of glimpse into the weirdness that is me. Today, we are going to take a look at the Sinai covenant. And before we do that, I want to make sure that we recap what kind of got us to here, where we see the family of Abraham, having been oppressed in Egypt, looked at as the stranger, is remembered by Adonai, who then redeems them from the gods of the nations with his judgment on those gods, because God is a man of war whenever the vulnerable are being oppressed. And as we discussed, those who are the redeemed are all who are faithful, those who are marked by the blood, who walk safely through the waters of wrath, the same waters that the gods of Egypt and their faithful followers are handed over to. These are the waters of chaos, which become a type of baptism for the Adonai faithful, the ones who emerge on the other side, purified from the impurity of Egypt. But of course, this is not the end of Abraham's family story. The mixed multitude journey to the mountain of God. Now, we know that this is not a smooth journey. It's full of wanderings and grumblings. But, as J.R.R. Tolkien said, not all who wander are lost. Because Adonai is merciful and gracious, he provides for them, and is long-suffering and slow to anger with their unfaithfulness. And today we will pick up the narrative where they reach the mountain of God itself. Now, if you will remember back in the He Who Causes to Be episode, we discussed how the mountain of God is not primarily a physical location. It is wherever Adonai appears in visible form or makes himself known. In Moses and the Burning Bush, we saw this at Horeb. Now, the people of Israel have already passed by Horeb. That's, in fact, where they got the water from the rock, which is a really interesting detail to me. Because when we are wandering in the wilderness, looking for God, we will often pass by the places where we used to find him. God may not lead us back to where we came from. He may wind up leading us to a different place, to somewhere new, to give a new revelation of himself. And that revelation that he gives to Israel happens at Sinai, 3 months after the Passover, which is another interesting detail, that God may not take us to his presence right away, like we discussed in our last episode, where we noted how Adonai led the Israelites by the long and winding path, testing and trying, or, as we discussed, proving their hearts. Now, this time of preparation is not just wasted time. It is necessary time to get them ready for what was to happen to them. They were about to enter into a covenant with the God of the universe. And not just a covenant, a marriage. That is the prophetic language that is used over and over and over to describe Adonai as Israel's husband. For example, Isaiah 54:5, quote, "For your Maker is your husband, the Lord of hosts is his name, the Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer, the God of the whole world he is called," end quote. Or Jeremiah 2:2-3, quote, "This is what the Lord says. I remember the devotion of your youth, how as a bride you loved me and followed me through the wilderness, through a land not sown. Israel was holy to Adonai, the firstfruits of his harvest. All who devoured her were held guilty, and disaster overtook them, declares the Lord," end quote. In the following chapter, he makes it incredibly explicit when he says, "Turn, O backsliding children, saith the Lord, for I am married to you." All of this in Jeremiah is recounting this story in Exodus, when Adonai won his bride out of the hands of her captors through mighty acts of judgment on them and led her to his home. And of course, people who have read the Bible are often familiar with the book of Hosea, which is an extended reenactment of an unfaithful wife and a long-suffering husband who both hands her over to her choices, but nevertheless comes back to her and redeems her from the consequences of those choices. Just like we discussed in Ezekiel 16 when we had our episode on the severe mercies of Adonai. Now, as I was quoting from the King James Version of Jeremiah 3 above, you might have noticed the blending of children and spouse language. And it is true. When we look at Israel as the bride of Adonai, we do have to set aside some icky responses, because Israel is talked about in polyvalent metaphors. Israel is described as simultaneously a bride, a son, a daughter, a servant, sheep, a friend, etc. If we take them all literally, that's going to cause some pretty significant and understandable moral outrage and logical confusion. So instead, we have to take the metaphor for what it is. Metaphors are meaning that expresses a real truth, but not the whole truth. And not every aspect of the metaphor is saying the same truth. So in a case like this, we have to remember that Adonai is like a husband and father, but ultimately he is beyond the limitations of those human categories. He can transcend what we cannot. So, with all those caveats in mind, let's return to understanding Sinai and the Mosaic covenant as the marriage covenant between Israel and Adonai. It follows the pattern of ancient Near East wedding ceremonies. Now, we discussed the first instance of covenant so far in the biblical text way back in season 1 when we discussed the waters of purification after the flood. We noted how berith in Hebrew usually refers to a kind of suzerain vassal treaty, where you have a high king and a lower prince, and they will often do things such as diplomatic marriages to solidify their brotherhood. And in those marriages, it makes the secondary king a part of the family of the high king. The high king promises to give them protection and benefits of all of their strength and power in return for tribute gifts and faithfulness to their kingship. And one of the interesting things we note is that narrative of Sinai as a marriage starts way back in the beginning of Exodus. There's a scholar by the name of Oliver Hersey who has made this marriage covenant at Sinai the subject of his dissertation. And in that dissertation, he identifies 16 shared stages that line up between A&E covenant marriage ceremonies and the narrative of Israel and Egypt going out to Sinai. And he says this: Israel is understanding herself as a really unique and special entity that can't be missed. She is the bride of the Lord. What a gift. What a beautiful, treasured possession. It's a special privilege to have that relationship, to have that level of intimacy. Let's just pause for a second in that description of the narrative and remember what Israel as a nation, as a people, have gone through at this point. They have endured trauma for hundreds of years. She has assimilated a slave mentality as her identity because of that time in slavery in Egypt. But Adonai is telling her, you are so much more to me than that. He's not telling her to ignore her past and move on. He's not blaming her for thinking about herself in this way. He is showing her a new and better way, a more beautiful and bride-like way, with a long-suffering and sacrificial husband, instead of a cruel slave master. And the beauty of seeing the Sinai covenant as a marriage ceremony is something that to me is really important. It's more than just theological minutia. Because if you remember back on our mixed multitude episode, I talked about the dangers and the problems inherent in replacement theology. And very often that theology is rooted in a view of the Sinai covenant as being the problem which Jesus came to solve, where the law is contrasted with grace or faith. And they say things like the law came to tell us what to do, where we have rules, and Jesus came to tell us how to live with him in a relationship. But frankly, that view mistakes the beauty and grace and love that was present at Sinai. Now, we will unpack this a lot more when we look closer at the law itself in a few later episodes. But for now, I just want to acknowledge that it is very easy to read this portion of Exodus and think that we are reading a list of thou shalt nots. In fact, the very next chapter contains the 10 Commandments, which have that exact language. And when we hear the word commandments, we tend to think of it like, I command you to do this or to not do this. But actually, that's not really what's happening at Sinai. How many of you have ever heard of those or seen, or maybe even have in your home, those "in this house we ... plaques"? That, I think, is the best way to think of the law and the Sinai covenant as house rules, and rules that are placed squarely in the context of a deep, personal, intimate relationship. And of course, it's valid to ask, well, what happens when we break those house rules? Well, the first thing I would note is that there is always a way provided to make it right again, to offer and receive mercy for our failings, what we call forgiveness, to make restitution with the person we have wronged, what we call reconciliation, and to clean up the mess that we have caused, what we call atonement. If we refuse to do this, there will be consequences, like when we have a family member that continually ignores and crosses our boundaries, despite numerous reminders and small-scale interventions, and eventually, at that point, living in their midst becomes untenable. If they will not respect the house rules, they do not get to enjoy the benefits of being in the house. So yes, there absolutely are curses and consequences in the Sinai covenant. But again, as we saw in the wilderness wanderings, these come after long suffering has run out. And additionally, we cannot overlook that the primary house member in question is Adonai himself, whose entire character is mercy, grace, and long-suffering, who does not need to protect himself for fear of being hurt, who loves them with an everlasting love, and who refuses to give up on them. And with that character, even when handing over or kicking out is required, he always longs for reconciliation and restoration. When Adonai promises a renewal of this very covenant to his people, he says this, quote, "It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them out of the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord." End quote. Adonai is not saying that he will end the one marriage and start over by remarrying someone else, a la replacement theology. He is saying that the entire relational dynamic will be different. The house rules will still be the same, but one of the parties in the marriage will be different. Since Adonai is the same in the Old Testament as he is in the New Testament, the one who will change will be humanity. And one of the effects of those change is that his bride will treat him like a husband, not like a master, because he doesn't want to patriarchally lord it over her, to demand obedience out of obligation or duty. He longs for a relationship with his bride. The Sinai covenant is all about relationship. Now, insofar as the Sinai covenant was seen as a list of rules by the people who received it, that is their mistake. That is not Adonai's heart. He wants them to see him as a gracious and loving husband, not as a master. To see his house rules as being freeing rather than constricting. And that's part of how I read the Sinai covenant. This entire process is Adonai teaching his bride how to treat him. He just got through rescuing her from her hard-hearted and leering slave owner. He's dressed her up in fine clothes and beautiful jewelry. He's led her away from all the things that will frighten her out in the wilderness. He's shown her love and long-suffering by patiently and gently putting up with her trauma responses, so that finally, at the end of all this, he can lead her home, to bring her back to the garden, to restart and recover after the first fall. And I did say that intentionally, because the best way to look at Sinai itself is as a recapitulation of the Garden of Eden. Because as we discussed back in season 1, Eden was on a mountain. In the A&E world, high places were places where people went to go meet the gods, the meeting places of heaven and earth, the liminal spaces where the fleshly and spiritual can coexist together. In Eden, we saw 4 rivers flowing out to water the whole earth. And that's the view that Adonai has at this point in the Exodus narrative of his redeemed bride, that she will be the rivers of living water flowing out for the healing of creation. Sinai is the redoing of Eden. In singing the Song of the Sea, the Israelites proclaim that Adonai brought them in and planted them on the mountain of his own possession. That is the same language that is used in Genesis 2, that God planted Adam in the garden. So we see the love story of God and his family begins in Genesis and runs all the way through Revelation. Now, of course, that love story is often obscured by our own lived experiences, and Adonai knows that. He's giving his bride a chance to undo what went wrong, to reteach her about who she is, to show her the beauty of who she can be, as a reflection of the beauty that he created her to be. His invitation to her is to remove the filthy rags from Egypt so that he can clothe her in her own pure white garments, not just for his own pleasure, but so that she can see herself as he does. And here again, we see the trauma-informed character of Adonai. Because what we know about trauma, one of the many effects of it, as I discussed in one of my How I've Hurt episodes, is excessive and inappropriate guilt, where we see low self-worth, poor self-esteem, thinking that all the bad things that happen to me are somehow my fault, because we see ourselves as dirty, as damaged goods. And so, often, we act like it. We don't think we deserve the good things in our life. So we sabotage and push away those good gifts, which just reinforces the belief that we are unworthy. Adonai wants to make sure that his bride does not experience those effects of trauma. He knows that his people see themselves like this because of their long time in slavery. He wants to show them a different way to see themselves, a way that purifies them all the way down to their hearts, a way that beautifies them in their own eyes as well as his, so that heaven and earth can merge together once more, just like they did in Eden. And that brings us to that merger in the marriage ceremony at Sinai. In the narrative of Exodus 19, Moses acts as a kind of matchmaker almost, going back and forth between the people and Adonai several times. Now, he's not acting as a matchmaker or mediator because they're wicked and God can't stand to see them. He's doing that because they're not yet ready to be the pure and spotless bride. And going up to the top of the mountain of Sinai is a bit like entering into the bridal chamber. And from here on throughout the rest of the episode, I will be very obliquely, not explicitly, referring to some, shall we say, adult themes. If that's something that bothers you, just want to make sure you get a content warning. But think of what happens in a bridal chamber. Candles, flower petals, the lights are very carefully dimmed, soft sheets, special garments. Everything has to be made ready. The bottom line here for Israel is, don't bring Egypt into the bridal chamber of Adonai. Instead, bring in what will satisfy both of them, both what Adonai likes and desires and what Israel likes and desires. Not the me that trauma and slavery taught her, but the pure and undefiled core of her, the creation that Adonai loves and deeply desires. And his process at Sinai is to gently and intimately draw that out of his people. And that raises an interesting exegetical question when we start reading through the narrative of Exodus 19. And that question is, was Israel actually supposed to go up to the top of Sinai or not? Frankly, I think it's a bit of an open question with textual indicators in both directions. And I put a link in the show notes for a back and forth conversation between Dr. Carmen Imes, who was our very first expertise episode, and Dr. Tim Mackey, who is on my wish list for a future expertise episode. It's too hard to really summarize all the details of the argument here, but I do just want to kind of lay out a sequence where the very first thing we see in Exodus 19 is Adonai telling the people that his original design was for the entire nation to be priests, that they would all, each and every one of them, be sanctified and set apart for holy service. And then after hearing that, all the people confirm that calling once they have the entire covenant, the whole marriage agreement, read in their presence. And so then Adonai tells Moses to consecrate the people because they're about to become priests. They have to cleanse themselves for 3 days and stay away from impurity of every kind. And during that time, do not touch the mountain because it is holy ground. But then Adonai says something really interesting. Quote, when the trumpet sounds a long blast at the end of that 3 days, they may go up on the mountain. End quote. Now, I just quoted from the NRSV translation. Some other translations say things like, come up to the mountain. And I chose that translation because I think it matches the flow of the narrative so far better. Adonai has already affirmed his desire to have the people be a kingdom of priests, so that all of them can enter in and be close to his presence. And they all agree. He tells them to make themselves holy so they can be that holy nation he wants them to be. And he tells them when and how to draw near to him, not just whenever and however they feel like it. But then comes this big, scary storm, and all the people are afraid, and they tremble with fear. And then the trumpet blasts. All right, Israel, time to go up. Deuteronomy 5 sheds a bit more light on the narrative of Exodus 19. This is Moses talking to the people of Israel. Quote, "When you heard the voice out of the darkness, while the mountain was burning with fire, you approached me, all the heads of your tribes and your elders, and you said, 'Look, Adonai our God has shown us his glory and greatness, and we have heard his voice out of the fire. We have seen this day that God may speak to someone, and that person may still live. But now, why should we die? For this great fire will consume us. If we hear the voice of Adonai our God any longer, we shall die. For who is there of all flesh that has heard the voice of the living God speaking out of the fire, as we have, and lived? Go near, you yourself, and hear all that Adonai our God will say. Then tell us everything that Adonai our God tells you, and we will listen and do it." End quote. So after that little moment of fear, Moses goes to the top alone and delivers the message of the people to Adonai. Quote, "And Adonai said to me, I have heard the words of these people, which they have spoken to you. They are right in all they have spoken. If only they had such a mind as this, to fear me and to keep all my commandments always, so that it might go well with them and with their children forever." End quote. Now, as I see it, there are two ways to read that line. First one is the way that Dr. Imes and, frankly, the majority of Protestant scholars read it. They read that passage in Deuteronomy 5 something like this. Yep, they weren't supposed to go out. This is a rare moment of clarity for the people. They know they don't belong up there with a holy God. Now, like I said, there is a minority report on how to read this. This is the position taken by scholars such as John Sailhammer and, of course, the previously mentioned Tim Mackey. In this reading, Adonai's response sounds a bit like this. Actually, the way the people reacted just reveals their weak hearts. If they would just have the courage, they would be just fine up here. But since they don't, they're right. They shouldn't come up here. Now, I am Team Mackey and Sailhammer. Draw your own conclusions. Why is all that important, though? Why does it matter in the context of trauma and church hurt? Because the way we read this text reveals Adonai's heart to us. Does he even want to be near us? Is he enforcing distance from the beginning, or is he only enforcing it after we prove unfaithful and his presence would be harmful to us? Does he only have in mind a very specific elite set of people to be near him? And in general, what the heck is he trying to do when he tests us? Because this moment is described in Exodus 20 as a test. This testing at Sinai is very similar to the testing that happens with Abraham and Isaac, where Adonai commands something that, frankly, we struggle to understand. Now, if we trust that he is a good father and we do our part to be obedient, he will do his part to be faithful, to give us blessing, and to enter into covenant relationship with us. However, if we shrink back out of fear, we will miss out. Now, of course, God will still work with us no matter what. In fact, that's exactly what a covenant is. An enduring and unbreakable commitment to the other party. If we are, quote unquote, outside the will of God, he will still bless us. But that blessing will take a different form than it would have otherwise. So ultimately, we're not told if Israel either passed or failed the test at Sinai. But frankly, I kind of think that binary is a bit too simplistic. Instead of looking at this as like a pass, fail, good, bad, maybe we should look at this as being something closer to like good, better, where they could have scored high marks by overcoming their fear, going up on the mountain, re-entering Eden as an entire whole people, where they all descend, just like Moses did, with their faces shining with uncreated light. Instead, their fear gets in the way. So God chooses to work within their fear and their weakness, and still make a way for them to re-enter Eden through an entire system of mediators and intercessors who can use pure and undefiled life to draw near to the God of life. And it is at this point that we skip forward to Exodus 24 and the title of our episode today, the ratification ceremony that involves the blood of the covenant. This is a bit like the signing of a marriage certificate in a modern wedding. The official legal moment where the two become one flesh. And of course, it has significant echoes backward to Passover, where the people were marked with the blood. There is a burnt offering and a peace offering, and there will be more to come later on describing those two offerings, but I will just say this. A burnt offering is simply an invitation for Adonai to come near, whereas a peace offering is a gift of thanksgiving and gratitude, the same kind as the one in the Passover. And in this context, neither one is an atoning offering or a sacrifice for sins, so to speak. In this ratification ceremony, we see blood being sprinkled, or in Hebrew, zarach. Now, I don't think sprinkled is the best translation because it's actually more like tossed or dashed or scattered or thrown. It's a fairly aggressive motion. And case in point from earlier, it is not the word used to describe how atonement blood is applied to the altar. And that is what happens with the blood of the covenant. Half of it is splashed or dashed or thrown on the base of the altar. Now, in the sacrificial system, the altar symbolizes Adonai himself. It's the sacred meeting place of heaven and earth. So half goes on the altar, and the other half is sprinkled on the people using a hyssop branch, as Hebrews tells us, just like in the Passover, marking them with blood, reaffirming Adonai's commitment to them. Several scholars have noted that in this process, there is a bond being created between the people and the altar. Like G. Henton Davies says, in the blood ritual, divine and human are organically related and become united. This is the sacramental at-one-ment of the covenant relationship. But again, just to reiterate, this at-one-ment is an at-one-ment that happens without reference to sin. It is a kind of relational entanglement. What happens to one happens to the other, no matter the distance or the quality of the relationship at the time. The people themselves are being bound to the altar, who represents Adonai himself. This entire process is part of the divine courtship of Adonai's bride. Abraham was the betrothal. Passover was the bride price. Sinai is the exchange of rings. And with that ratification ceremony, the marriage is sealed. There is no going back to being slaves. They are now the spotless bride of Yahweh, cleansed and consecrated by blood. And following that, the people share a ceremonial sacrificial meal up on the top of Sinai, in the bridal chamber itself. Having been made ready, they approach the inner sanctum, the bridal chamber, trembling with nervousness and uncertainty, but also joy and delight and desire. And as they open the door, a carefully prepared meal is laid out before them. The husband, in this drama, gives to his wife of the labor of his body, his blood, sweat, and tears, the work of his hands. And the wife gives to her husband the labor of her body, the gift of her vulnerability and nakedness, a surrender of her most precious gift. Now, not just her body, any more than the man's work is just his body. It is all of her, body and soul, just as he gives to her body and soul. This moment of sacrificial reunion is the undoing of the garden curse. The man was told that he would toil the ground, it would resist his labors, and his own sense of well-being and identity and selfhood would depend on that. And the woman was told that she would toil in conception, that her soil might resist her labors, that her desire might betray her. And at Sinai, another step is taken to undo that first fall, where the husband, Adonai, shares a meal with his bride. He gives to her out of his overflowing love and graciousness. She gives back to him out of gratitude and love. They're both vulnerable to each other. Adonai, because he is committed to these people, and Israel is vulnerable because she is weak and hard-hearted and is likely to stray. And in that context, the wife, Israel, surrenders herself to her husband in an act of entwining and entanglement, not one that removes her autonomy, but one that honors her autonomy and choice. Like the narrative of both Exodus 19 and 24 says, the people respond, all that Adonai has spoken, we will do. It is that mutual surrender that makes the two become one flesh, so that heaven and earth can be reunited once more. And the fruit of that union will be the Son of Man and the Son of God, just like we see in the Lord's Supper, or in the term I prefer, the Eucharist, which means the gift of grace. Quote, while they were eating, Jesus took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it, gave it to the disciples, and said, take, eat, this is my body. Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, saying, Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." End quote. In that moment, Jesus is reenacting the Sinai covenant with his disciples. He is playing the role of Moses, the appointed intercessor and mediator, the conduit of divine grace to all humanity. He's also Adonai, the incarnate word giving gifts of grace, humbling himself and making himself vulnerable and naked before his people. And his disciples are the 70 elders from the 12 tribes we see in Exodus 24, the ones who enter into the inner room, the sanctum sanctorum, to eat and drink a meal with their God as an act of worship and covenant renewal. And that renewal is necessary because in the narrative of the Bible at this point in Matthew's gospel, Israel was an unfaithful bride. Adonai had to send her away in anger, but he was now calling her back in love and tenderness, inviting her to come to the mountain of the Lord, the place where God is, where heaven and earth meet, to reconsecrate herself to him, so that he would no longer be seen by her as master, but instead would be seen by her as a husband.
Why don't you explain this to me like I'm 5?
Okay, ready? God has won his bride, and he patiently leads her through the wilderness back to his home. There he invites her to join him in marriage, to make herself and the world whole again. The wedding ceremony ends when their hearts are bonded with blood and their bodies are merged with a meal. So my challenge for you today is, well, not really about today, because we are about to embark on a lengthy exploration of literally hundreds of rules. It will be very easy to get lost in the minutiae and the details. Now, I will do my best to keep us oriented toward the loving husband of Adonai, and to help us see how these house rules are the ones that make the marriage as a whole function best. But I would just encourage you, as we take this journey, try as much as you are able, with whatever you have for as long as you can, try to keep the character of Adonai front and center. To ask, why is this here? It's very easy to do that skeptically, to kind of assume that the burden of proof is on God's side, that he needs to justify those rules to us. I don't mean to say that flippantly. It's very understandable, because often our experience of rules is something like, well, because I told you so. And that's something that happens inside and outside the church. Within the church, we are often told, follow these rules of God's or else. And the stakes are literally infinite, with very little explanation as to why. And in fact, very often, just the simple question of why is discouraged or even punished. So, I am encouraging you to ask why. I want you to be wrestling with the content of some of these laws. But I would ask and recommend that when you do so, you try as much as you're able to ask why out of sympathy, to ponder and meditate on who Adonai is, to consider what we already know for sure about his character, what he's already done, not just for Israel in the story, but for us in our lives, and to not lose sight of what we have learned about how much he wants to dwell with us in our midst, to make his home with us, to make us his bride, to make us the inheritors of the entire cosmos. And perhaps just try that as an experiment. See what happens, see what comes of it. And as you perform that experiment, see if it doesn't change your views on either religion or relationship. Rather than seeing them as contradictory, it's not a religion, it's a relationship, you might be able to find that you can see them as being complementary, where no religion is worth anything without a relationship. But conversely, no relationship will ultimately survive without some rules as its anchor point. In the end, my hope is that you might be able to see our journey through the law as a chance to encounter God, to unlearn the lessons that trauma has taught us about him, and instead to relearn the lessons that he teaches us about himself. And that's where I'll leave you today. On YouTube and X, you can find me at Church Kid Pod, and on Facebook, you can join the discussion in our discussion group, Trauma Informed Church Kids. If you find this content either enjoyable or important, please hit the like button and/or subscribe on whatever platform you listen to. Of course, ratings, reviews, and sharing with others is the best way to increase visibility and ensure that more people hear or see this content. If you have questions or want to engage in dialogue, leave a comment on that platform. Alternatively, you can leave a voice message on SpeakPipe, and I will add it to the Q&R episodes at the end of the season. Finally, just one last word to everyone. I don't know your story, but I know the one who is walking with you in your story. I know that he loves you. He made you for a purpose, and that his plan for you is always better. If you have been hurt by the church, I am sorry for the ways in which we have borne the name in vain. That is our responsibility to repair and repent. I hope that this podcast starts you on your own journey to find resurrection on the other side of deconstruction. My prayer for you is the words of St. Paul to the Ephesians. I ask God that you may know the love of Christ, which is more than we can ever know. I ask that you may be filled with everything that God has. See you next time.